All right. Good afternoon and welcome to our fourth lecture on philosophy of management. Today's lecture we are going to be discussing in this fourth lecture, we are going to be discussing the major philosophical schools of thought, or we are going to be discussing the major research paradigms in management research. Largely, our focus would be on trying to understand what we mean by ontology and the nature of reality. I think for the next three lectures are going to be centered around understanding various components of the research paradigms, the major research paradigms in management research. This week, our focus will be on ontology and the nature of reality. This week also happens to be my last week of handling this part of the course. Next week, my colleague, Professor Haruna, will take charge and look at the other aspects of the major research paradigms. Whilst our concentration would be on ontology and the nature of reality, the subsequent lectures will look at epistemology and the methodological aspects of the research paradigms, as well as some guiding principles that will guide our research in terms of the philosophical guidelines or underpinnings, depending on which philosophical or research paradigms you would be adopting for your research. Now, to do this, we'll be looking at what the nature of reality is in organizational settings. We'll then try to compare our understanding of what we mean by objective reality and subjective reality. We'll also look at critically the aspect of social construction of reality. And then we'll see how all of this can shape research methods, because in the last 3 weeks, we have been talking about how one's philosophical underpinnings or one's worldview would influence the research methods you'd use. So today marks the beginning of our core understanding of the critical components of the research paradigms. And we begin that by looking at ontology and the nature of reality. Now, to do that, we'll be looking at three main research paradigms. And this would be positivism, interpretivism, and critical realism. So you'd see that the rest of the discussions regarding the philosophy of management would be centering on the isms in the philosophy of management. Now, our focus would be to look at positivism, interpretivism, and critical realism. And for each of them, we'll be interested in trying to have a basic understanding of what the philosophy is, how it originated, the key points, the critiques regarding that particular research philosophy. When we have done this for each of the three paradigms listed, then we'll now look at the implications of our understanding of these three research paradigms in determining the research methods we would adopt in our research. So we'll hit it off with the positivism. Now, we have to understand that our use of the word positivism as a research paradigm, people who believe in that paradigm will refer to them as positivists. Similarly, those who believe and adopt the interpretivism paradigm will refer to them as interpretivists, and then critical realists. So we'll start off with positivism. Now, positivism can basically be explained as a way of inquiry or approach to understanding reality by adopting a scientific and an empirical approach scientific and empirical approach. The keywords there are scientific and empirical. Now, positivism started a long time ago, but it gained prominence in the 19th century during the period of what is usually referred to as the period of Enlightenment. Now, the period of Enlightenment is a period where many consider as the age of, they call it the age of reason, where a lot of intellectual and cultural movements sprang up somewhere in the 18th century. And this Enlightenment era emphasized that people should consider reason over superstition. People should consider reason over superstition and science, over blind faith. So instead of just blindly accepting things, we need to use our reason to accept it, somewhere around the 18th century. And it gained prominence in the 19th century. Now, how did positivism originate? How did positivism originate? Positivism originated as a philosophical school of thought somewhere in the 16th, 17th century by the French philosopher Auguste Comte. And then we look at some key issues that Comte came out with. Now, if we relate Comte and positivism, one prominent thing that comes across is that he is considered as the founder of positivism. And one distinguishing feature that he also emphasized was the fact that whatever we do, whatever phenomena we're looking at should be confined to observable data that are observable. And that is why we define positivism as being scientific and empirical. Now, positivism's view of the world is that of materialism, that everything we see, we have to see it in black and white in the material world, and we reject things that we cannot emphasize by using empirical evidence. Now, the key things regarding positivism are that positivism emphasizes things that we can observe and things that we can easily quantify. So it emphasizes observable facts and quantifiable data. Now, through positivism, we often will argue that reality can only be understood through what we can measure and what we can verify or validate. So let's get this carefully. Things that I can clearly observe, things that I can clearly quantify are the main issues that surround our understanding of what positivism is about. In terms of objectivity, researchers who use positivism are often described as being value neutral. And being value neutral, it means that researchers do not form part of the research, as opposed to other paradigms where the researcher may be considered as an integral part of the research process. And I remember sometime last week, someone asked a question when I introduced these paradigms, that is it possible that one can be relying on positivism and have research hypothesis? It is possible. And I remember one of your colleagues highlighted the fact that he has come across a scenario where a positivist researcher largely use hypothesis, and their use of hypothesis largely hinge on using a particular kind of reasoning, the reasoning we call deductive reasoning. And I remember, I think a couple of weeks ago, we looked at 3 different kinds of reasoning: inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, and I think abductive. So hypotheses are tested using deductive reasoning. In terms of methodology, we have to note that positivists often rely on the quantitative research methods or approaches that involve the use of surveys, experiments, or statistical analysis. Now, one critical limitation, or one major criticism of the positivist approach is the fact that it oversimplifies very complex phenomena because it sees it in black and white. Those who are of other paradigms will say that positivism does not provide critical or in-depth insight into phenomena because it sees phenomena in black and white. So largely, people will criticize positivist researchers by saying that they oversimplify research phenomena or social phenomena they are looking at because they ignore the subjective experiences the researcher will go through and the subjective experiences participants will also go through. And also the fact that positivist researchers much often than not would ignore contextual aspects of the phenomena they are looking at. So basically, this is what we can say about positivism. Now, positivism has been around for a very, very long time. For a very long time. In opposition to positivism came another major paradigm called interpretivism, or what others will refer to as phenomenology. And the two are basically the same. Phenomenology basically looks at the fact that if we are going to ascribe meaning to things, the ultimate source of meaning to things depends on the experiences of people, experiences of research participants, and the experience of the researcher himself or herself. Now, a basic understanding of what interpretivism is, we cannot explain it without emphasizing the fact that interpretivism focuses on how the researcher and research participants make meaning depending on the context. So much often than not, we emphasize interpretivism by emphasizing the subjective understanding or the subjective constructions the researcher and the research participants would make. Now, one other important thing about interpretivism is the fact that it is associated largely with qualitative research methods, whilst positivism is associated with quantitative research. Now, to explain positivism much better, I would want to rely on the parable of the blind man and an elephant. And I know many of you may have heard of the parable of the blind man, that there used to be some blind men in a society. And one day they heard that a particular animal had been brought into their community. And because they were all blind, they agreed that the best way they could understand what kind of animal it was to go and physically feel the animal. So when they got to the animal was an elephant. So when they got there, they all had different feelings of different parts of the animal. Now, the first man felt the task and retorted that considering what he is feeling, because remember that they were all blind, considering what he is feeling, he feels that, or he thinks that the animal is a spear, because the task the blind man was feeling was pointed and sharp. Then another felt the trunk, and they retorted that, oh, I think this animal is a snake. Then another one managed to get on top of the animal and felt the ear and indicated that, this animal is a fan. And then another felt the trunk and said that this animal looks like a tree trunk. And then another who felt the side of the animal said that it is the animal is like a wall. As the last person felt the tail and described the animal as looking like a tail. Now, the moral of this parable of the blind man and the elephant is that we human beings have the tendency to claim absolute knowledge or truth based on our limited subjective understanding or experience. And when we do, we ignore other people's limited and subjective experiences. Remember, forgetting that the subjective experiences of our colleagues or other people may equally be true and may equally be valuable. But our description based on our experiences will hold it as the absolute truth. forgetting that the others, what the others are saying could also be true. And this portrays clearly what the interpretivist goes through. So for an interpretivist, a lot of things will shape the interpretivist understanding and construction of a phenomenon, depending on what probably the gestures interviewees were putting up when the gestures, the emotions interviewees were putting up when the researcher was interviewing them. The researchers may interpret it differently. Another thing is that if a researcher is interviewing a group of interviewees and does not understand the cultural nuances of these interviews properly, the researcher can misunderstand their emotions or their gesticulations to mean something else other than what they mean. So all of this will depend on where one is sitting. Another critical thing one can use to explain the concept of interpretivism is the fact that if you look at this diagram I have just indicated, one standing on another side and another on the other side looks at the digit, the number 9 or 6. But depending on where one stands, one can say that that digit is 6 or it is 9. And the thing is that just because one says that it is 6, depending on whether you are standing on the left, or it is 9, depending on whether you are standing on the right, it doesn't mean that you are wrong. It is simply because depending on where you are standing, you are not just seeing life from the perspective of the other person. So when we are talking about interpretivism, we usually would talk of the issue of multiple reality. So whilst the guy at the left says that this digit or this inscription is the number 6, the other one sees it as what? As 9. In that case, there's no one unique reality. Reality depends on where they are standing. And that's what interpretivism is all about. Now, there is another one. If you look at the number of rods placed on the ground, depending on where one is standing, one could count it as being what? 3 or 4. And it doesn't mean that they are wrong. So it could be 3, depending on if you are standing on the right-hand side, or it could be what? 4, depending on whether you are standing on the left-hand side. And I think some time ago, I shared my experiences of how being an interpretivist researcher during my PhD days and how it affected understanding of some of the things I was looking at during my PhD and the back and forth I had to go through with some of the audience who were seated during my viva. Now, how did interpretivism originate? Interpretivism originated as a response to positivism. So it originated early in the 20th century at the University of Chicago. And it has been pioneered by people like George Herbert Mead and Charles Horton Cooley, who focus on the issue of what they refer to as symbolic interactionism. Now, if we look at symbols, the way we interpret the meaning of symbols differ, sometimes on our lived experiences. The interpretation, for instance, the interpretation of a rainbow in some countries will be different from the interpretation of the symbol rainbow in other countries. Some will see it as a symbol of LGBTQ plus or whatever. And others will just see it maybe as a decoration of some sort. So depending on where one stands, one could also use symbolic interactionism to explain the different perspectives that could arise from how we perceive things. So more often than not, we say that interpretivism introduced the idea of reality being socially constructed. Reality is socially constructed. Okay. Other pioneers of the interpretivist domain is people like Max Weber, a German sociologist and philosopher, who also brought the idea of what he referred to as Westerhen, understanding approach. So as interpretivists, whatever we would consider as reality depends largely on our understanding, and our understanding can be shaped by a number of things: our lived experiences, the context in which the phenomena is being studied, and many, many other things. Now, the key points in terms of interpretivism are, so going back a bit, we indicated not long ago that positivism relies largely on objective reality. But when we're talking about interpretivism, we are looking at what we refer to as subjective reality, because we consider reality to be constructed by people and based on the interpretations of the people, their lived experiences and whatnot. And also the fact that when we are looking at reality using the interpretivist lens, we are looking at reality in terms of what? Multiple perspectives and multiple realities. Okay. So also in terms of interpretivism, as opposed to positivism, in positivism, we often say that there is value neutrality. The researcher is not part of the research. So the researcher will stand aloof and observe things as they are and report them as they are. But when we are talking about interpretivism, understanding will depend on the researcher empathizing with the participants and their experiences. So based on the participants' experiences and the researcher's experience, that is how reality will emerge. The interpretivist paradigm relies largely on inductive reasoning as opposed to deductive reasoning that is largely used by positivists. And also dealing with interpretivists, we are largely dealing with qualitative researchers, and our data will largely come through interviews, case studies, ethnography, and whatnot. Now, the main critique of interpretivism is the fact that many people say that if you look at the way positivism is, it is scientific, and people consider it to be rigorous. People consider it to be very, very empirical. And also, people often say that if you are a positivist or you are doing positivist research, your research is often very, very generalizable. But if you are doing an interpretivist research, which is largely qualitative, people argue that interpretivism lacks scientific rigor. And when we are talking about scientific rigor, we are basically interested in the fact that if someone has gone through a number of steps to arrive at an outcome, if you also follow it, you should arrive at that outcome. We are basically saying that when it comes to interpretivism, that cannot happen. The likelihood of that happening is very, very slim, because if I go through process A, B, C, based on my lived experiences, my mental constructions, and the constructions of my participants, how I'm going to come about reality and knowing reality will be different if somebody also goes through that same process, because the lived experiences and the constructions of that person and the way the person will view things will be very, very different. Okay, so one main critique of interpretivism is that it lacks rigor, scientific rigor, and generalizability. Apart from that, when we are dealing with interpretivism, often it is difficult to establish causality in terms of causal relationship between two or more variables. Then the third one is critical realism, and we'll use this diagram to explain basically what critical realism may involve. It also involves the issue of seeing reality in different layers. So if you look at the tree carefully, you would see that the branches are there. If you also look at the branches and the trunk, yeah, a little bit of difference in reality. And then we have the roots, which are buried and not observable at all. So it's critical realism basically seeks to bridge the gap between positivism and interpretivism. So critical reality stands in between the two of them. Critical realism was developed by the philosopher Roy Bhaskar in the late 20th century. Now, the key points are that when we are dealing with critical realism, we are looking at reality not in black and white. Reality not in terms of the mental constructions or the lived experiences of the researcher and the research participants, but we are looking at reality as consisting of what? 3 layers. The first layer being observable events, probably the branches of the trees, the leaves and whatnot, and then the actual reality, the underlying structure and mechanisms, probably the trunk of the tree. and then the real reality. And the real reality is the deep causal forces. That's the deep causal forces upon which the empirical and the actual reality stands on. So in terms of critical realism, we often say that it operates on the basis of what we refer to as a dialectic. It has a dialectic approach, and this dialectic approach involves the fact that researchers will explore both observable phenomena. And remember, we indicated that when we are looking at observable phenomena, we are looking at positivism and underlying causes. It also looks at what is called retroduction, which combines both induction and deduction. So often than not, when we are looking at methodology in terms of critical realism, the methodology adopted in line with that stands between qualitative and what? And quantitative. In that case, we would have what is referred to as a mixed. So we'll use both qualitative, drawing on it, probably ideas from interpretivism, and quantitative, drawing on ideas of what? Positivism. Then we'll have critical realism. Now, the problem with critical realism, the main critique of critical realism is the fact that it is too complex to apply, especially practically, very complex, because it requires a balance between empirical evidence and theoretical insights. The fact that it combines both positivism, elements of positivism, and elements of interpretivism. Okay, so these are the three main paradigms. Now, the best way for us to understand the major paradigms and their application in research is for us to consider it in the context of management research, in the context of organizations. That is why in our next slide, we are going to be looking at ontology and organizational reality. So when we're talking about ontology, basically we are talking about the issue of what? Reality. That's what we are talking about. So we are now going to look at these concepts in the context of organizational setting. So ontology basically refers to the state of existence or the nature of being, reality. And it looks at the fundamental questions about what exists, how things interact, and the underlying structures of what? Reality. So if you look at the three paradigms, basically, we can look at ontology in terms of positivism, ontology in terms of interpretivism, and ontology in terms of critical realism. And I have often been saying that when we are looking at positivism, reality is often seen as what? Black and white, observable, quantifiable data. But in terms of interpretivism, we are looking at it in terms of what? Mental constructions, social constructions of lived experiences based on the context. Okay. So why is the study of ontology important to us? It is important because our understanding of reality or ontology is crucial for our understanding of the very fabric of organizational reality. So for instance, if you are studying a particular phenomenon, you have to understand the nature of the phenomena in terms of ontology. How did this thing come into being? It is only when you understand how it came into being or how it exists that you'll be able to understand the phenomena very well and understand how you can go about knowing the phenomenon. Okay, so now let's see if we can find some examples in terms of ontology within organization, the nature of reality within organizational settings. We have already indicated that dealing with ontology depends on a number of perspectives. So ontology could be, when I say ontology, I'm basically referring to reality could be objective. It could be what? Subjective. First, we want to look at objective reality. When we are talking about objective reality, it is clear that we are looking at it in the context of what? Positivism. Because in positivism, we see that reality consists of what? Observable facts. So for instance, in an organizational setting, examples of reality would be the office buildings, financial statements, and production processes that we can see clearly. Now, the implications are that objective reality provides a foundation for as in organizational settings, to be able to make decisions and operate efficiently. As opposed to objective reality, subjective reality depends on individual perceptions and their beliefs and their experiences. So more often than not, subjective reality will involve people's attitude, how they view things and how they perceive things, and how their past experiences shape their understanding of what? Of those things. So for instance, if we're talking about subjective reality, examples of subjective reality would be employee morale. So for instance, in an organizational setting, if I want to find out from employees what boosts their morale, you will see that everyone would have a different understanding of what will boost his or her morale. In that case, I can say that morality is a subjective what? I can say that employee morale is what? Is a subjective what? Reality. Similarly, organizational culture. Organizational culture differs from one organization to the other. Leadership styles also differ. Even within organizations, the leadership styles differ. The head could have a different leadership style, and the subordinates or other unit heads could have different leadership styles because the way they perceive leadership is different from how the leader sees. So leadership styles is also an example of a subjective reality. Practically, subjective reality influences a number of things in organizational settings. For instance, team dynamics, employee behavior, and the climate within the organization. But the question I want to ask is it possible that we can have a coexistence of objective and subjective reality within an organization? Is that possible? Because I'm asking this question because if you look at our explanation of what critical realism is, we are basically saying that we are basically looking at reality at different layers, drawing concepts or understanding from positivist approaches and drawing understanding from interpretivist approaches to arrive at the critical realist objective. So it is possible that within an organization, we can have a coexistence of objective and subjective reality, all existing within that organization. So organizations often have to go through an interplay of subjective and objective reality by looking at objective facts interacting with what? Subjective interpretations or experiences of people. The problem with this is that it can be a challenge in balancing objective and subjective realities within an organization, and most often than not, balancing objective and subjective realities within an organization can lead to organizational conflicts. So balancing these two can be complex. A typical example would be combining objective metrics, for instance, like financial performance and employee perception, or combining formal structures in terms of hierarchy and informal networks, for instance, grapevine information. Okay, now all of this, how does it influence our methodology? How does it influence our methodology? I'm going to jump quite a number of things and go straight into how it can affect our methodology. But before that, yeah, let me just go to. Yes. So, yeah, so let's look at how the issue of ontology can have implications for our methodology, because the reason why we have been emphasizing that our understanding of the research paradigms as put forward by Gruber and Lincoln, Kuhn and Co., it is important because the research paradigms will influence our research methodology and the choice of our research methods. So just to recap before we look at how it can, the paradigms can shape our methodology, let's go a little bit back and look at what we mean by ontology and what we mean by positivism, interpretivism, and then critical realism. Yes, so ontology basically, as we have said, refers to our assumptions about reality, existence, and what can be known. Now, different ontological positions will shape how we approach our research going forward. And our emphasis here is to see how these ontological positions would shape our research methods. Our research methods being either a quantitative or a qualitative one. Okay, so the first one, positivist approach. The ontological assumptions behind a positivist approach is that reality is what? Is objective. Reality is measurable. And the process of our research is what? Scientific and empirical. And we also indicated that the research methods often that fall in line with the positivist approach is the quantitative research methods, the use of survey instruments and whatnot, and also the emphasis on generalizability. In terms of the interpretivist paradigm, the ontological position is that reality is always what? Subjective. It is socially constructed, and it depends on what? The context. And often we say that we will use the qualitative research methods approach by collecting our data through interviews, case studies, and what have you. Now, in your subsequent lectures, next week and going forth, what you are going to be confronted with would be the issues of epistemology, which largely would be dealing with knowledge and how you would get to know the reality. How do you go about knowing your reality? Now, if you look carefully at our understanding of the ontological positions for positivist approach and the interpretivist approach, you will realize that if one is going to combine, if one is thinking about combining several research methods, and I'm looking at this in the context of what we did, I think, in the first lecture or so, the issue about triangulation, using multiple methods or multiple data sources to come up with our findings. Our reliance on positivism and interpretivism is clearly delineated in terms of the research approach we would use. But if we are going to rely on critical realist approach, it means that we are going to be doing some bits of what? Triangulation in terms of our use of both quantitative research methods and some qualitative research methods. Okay. Now, what are the practical implications? What are the practical implications of understanding these research paradigms and how it influences our research methods or approach is that our ontological position is supposed to clearly or importantly shape how we come up with our research questions. So for instance, if you are coming up with your research questions should be formulated in such a way that they align clearly with your ontological stance or your ontological position. So if I'm going to come up with my research questions, objectives, I have to make sure that if my research paradigm is a positivist one, that means that my research questions should reflect my research position and my ontological stance, how I see reality. The same thing applies to when we are dealing with sampling, considering the nature of participants we want to use in the research, either at the individual level, group level, or organizational level. Our research paradigm will also shape that. The same thing applies to our data collection and our data analysis. The main reason behind our treatment and emphasis of the research paradigms is to emphasize how our worldview and our philosophical assumptions will shape the rest of our research in terms of research questions, in terms of how we collect our data, where we collect our data, and how we analyze our data. So you cannot have a mix-up of you having and you viewing reality as objective, or having a positivist, or you're having an objective ontological stance, and then formulating research questions that are subjective in nature. Similarly, your research questions cannot follow an ontological stance that is interpretivist, and then you go about collecting your data using a positivist approach. So there should be a clear alignment in terms of how your research questions are formulated, how your data is collected, and how your data is analyzed. All what we are doing hinges on these core components, these practical considerations that we are talking about. And throughout our research, our ontological positions, our epistemological positions that should all align to determine our methodology specifically in terms of how we are going to collect and analyze our data. Now, many often raise the issue of ethics when we are looking at the different ontological positions or the different paradigms. So, for instance, with the interpretivist researcher, where the researcher himself is considered a participant, many people would often say that the research is totally biased because the researcher has put himself in there. But for many interpretivists, the researcher's own ontological position is important and should influence the research process because the researcher himself is part of the research. And more often than not, you will come across the term reflexivity. That is what it refers to. And mostly it is the interpretivist researcher who go through this reflexive exercise of putting themselves within or inside the research. To conclude, I would want to emphasize that when we are looking at all these three major research paradigms, we have to recognize that the ontology, the reality, our ontological stance, and the methodological position we are going to follow, the two of them are intertwined. So we must always choose methods that align very well with our philosophical position or philosophical stance. You also have to understand that just going through the lecture today will not make you an expert in terms of the research paradigms. You have to continue to learn and read. What we are providing for you is the guidance, the initial understandings of the major paradigms and how they can influence your research in terms of the methodology, in terms of your data collection, analysis, and so on. Okay. Thank you very much. I think I have come to the end of my ranting on the philosophical paradigms, major philosophical paradigms. And this being my fourth lecture, I think I'm drawing the curtains on my formal lectures with you on the philosophy of management. Now, I want to emphasize one thing, though I've already given an assignment on the role of theory. There is going to be another assignment on the research philosophies. And I want to emphasize one thing. From now on, we all have to be very, very serious about coming up with our research topics. Because it is only when you have an idea about your research, the area you want to study, that you can critically think about these terms, you can critically think about these concepts and properly relate them. I will advise that some of the exercises we are given, when we get to settle on a research topic early, it will be easier for you because all the exercises you are going to be doing will be based largely on that particular topic, and that will broaden your perspective regarding that topic very well as you go on to the actual research work in terms of writing up your proposal and proceeding with it. So the learning will continue, and as I have done in the past, I will continue to share much more research papers with you regarding this particular topic. And as I have said in some of my lectures, these are things you are going to continue to deal with till you finish the PhD and beyond. So most often than not, we don't consider this as things you should know now and now. You continue learning. And as you learn, you become better and better with it. And the easiest way to do that is to have at least some topic which you can relate to in terms of the different philosophical underpinnings, in terms of the epistemology and the methodology you could possibly use to study that phenomena. Thank you.